the resurrection is God's declaration that life comes from outside of ourselves, and that He is the source of life, and through the resurrection, that life is made available to us as His people.
Welcome to Conversations with Tyndale House Scholars in America, featuring Tyndale House scholars and their work in the United States. Each episode, we deliver great interviews with biblical scholars to share about their work and how their time at Tyndale House has impacted the church in America. In this episode, let's listen as George Davis, senior pastor at Hershey Free Church in Hershey, Pennsylvania, and Steve Bryan, professor of New Testament at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, discuss inconspicuous connections found in the resurrection accounts of Matthew and John.
Steve, I want to thank you for joining me for this conversation on behalf of Tyndale House, Cambridge. Now, much of your academic work has focused on the Gospels, and we're preparing to celebrate Easter. So as we prepare to celebrate Easter, let's talk about the resurrection accounts. And specifically in your work, you have argued there are certain themes in these accounts that we may have missed. So let's just discuss a couple of those. First of all, let's start with Matthew's Gospel. You've argued there's a link between the Easter narrative and the opening of the Gospel. So would you explain that?
Yeah, a lot of people talk about the Christmas inclusio, the naming of Jesus, giving Jesus the name Emmanuel there in chapter 1 of Matthew corresponds to the very end, the Great Commission text. Emmanuel means God with us, and then the promise of Jesus to I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. So a lot of people think about the Christmas inclusio, but there's also, I think, what we might call an Easter inclusio. And if we, pull back a little bit into the genealogy of Matthew, there's a well-known problem in Matthew's gospel. People have recognized it going all the way back to Chrysostom. Chrysostom asks, he tells us that he's given us 42 names, 42 generations. Why are there only 41? And so people have puzzled over this, or, are we supposed to count one of the names twice? There's also another thing that's missing in the genealogy. And again, it's in that third, we might call a third table of the genealogy. The first two tables have a reference to brothers. So Judah and his brothers in the first table, Jeconiah and his brothers in the second table, but no brothers referred to in the third table. So there seems to be an unexpected asymmetry, as well as an unexpected blank or gap in the narrative with this missing generation.
Right.
And so what I've tried to argue is that Matthew leaves that gap intentionally, and that he fills it out in the Easter narrative. If you remember in Matthew's Easter narrative, the two women go to the tomb. An angel tells them to go and tell the disciples that Jesus is going to go ahead and out of them into Galilee. And so they run away in fear and joy to tell the disciples. They're doing exactly what they're told. And then Jesus meets them on the road, and he tells them exactly the same thing that the angels have told them. Go tell them that I'm going to meet them ahead. Go ahead and meet them in Galilee. And the question is, what purpose does this serve? And I think the clue is in one significant change. Jesus says, "Go and tell my brothers." It's the first time they're addressed. The disciples are addressed as his brothers. And so I think Messiah and his resurrected, the resurrected Messiah and his brothers, that kind of fills out the gap in the genealogy. And so it provides a kind of rounded picture. We read the beginning in terms of the end, and we understand then what this messianic people looks like. It looks like the resurrected Messiah and his now 11 brothers. This is the reconstitution of God's messianic people.
So I presume then that's why you think Matthew goes to the trouble of creating that puzzle in his narrative.
Yeah, it is. It is a kind of puzzle. And as you read through the whole of the gospel, I think a careful reader sort of sees this missing piece in the genealogy, is puzzling over it throughout, and then it's in the genealogy that he creates for his readers a kind of aha moment. So the disciples are the 11 disciples with the Messiah. They are a picture of Israel, and that's how he completes the genealogy. So another scholar Jason Hood has noticed the connection to, the brothers in the resurrection narrative, with the references to brothers in the genealogy, and then I'm trying to argue that this is actually how the genealogy gets its proper conclusion.
So in a real sense, the Christian movement is brought into the ongoing history of Jesus's work, or God's work with his people.
Exactly.
Yeah. And
so there is, I think, an Easter inclusio there in Matthew's gospel.
That's just a unique link between the beginning and the end of Matthew's gospel. Well, let's go to another example that I think you would want to highlight, and that's found in John's gospel, particularly things that we may miss in the interaction between Mary Magdalene and Jesus after the resurrection.
Yeah, there's a number of curiosities about John's account of the resurrection. He's got this sort of singular focus on Mary. So he's only looking at the one figure, and so as the disciples go away, she's left in the garden, Mary Magdalene, that is, and she's just there in the garden, and then this figure whom she mistakes as a gardener comes up to her,
right,
and she doesn't recognize him, and then something happens and creates the recognition. Back in chapter 10, Jesus said, "My sheep hear my voice, and I call them by name," and goes on to say, "And I give them eternal life." And I think that's significant, and it's not unique to me for sure, but other commentators have noticed this connection between chapter 10 and chapter 20, because when he says her name, Mary, that's all he has to say, and she recognizes him. She knows him when he calls her by name. But I think the significance goes a bit beyond that, because her response then is to call him Rabboni.
Right.
And there's been a lot of discussion of this, and I think some recent study has shown that this term it's not significantly different from the short form rabbi.
Right.
Some have suggested it's an Aramaic term, and this is why John translates it again. So when the term rabbi first occurs back in chapter 1, he translates it. He says, now this word means teacher. And now it occurs again in the resurrection narrative, and he translates it again. This term means teacher. But both terms were known in both Aramaic and in Hebrew, both the long form and the short form. So I don't think it's because it's shifted language that he has to translate it. Instead, I think teacher has a very particular connotation for him, for John. We see this a little bit of this about the other Mary of Bethany in chapter 11. So if you remember, Jesus identifies himself to Martha. Martha, he says, "I'm the resurrection and the life." And Jesus says, "Do you believe this?" And she says that she does. She does believe that he's the resurrection and the life. And then she immediately goes to get Mary. And it doesn't tell us that Jesus told her to go get Mary. She just leaves and goes to get him. And there's a kind of a peculiarity in John chapter 11, because he hasn't said anything to Martha. Martha just goes. But when Martha gets to Mary, she says this to Mary, "The teacher is calling you." So specifically, the teacher is calling you. So this term Rabboni, that's then translated teacher, I think, is kind of John's particular designation of Jesus as the one who teaches life. So Rabboni, if it means anything different from rabbi, it is the teacher who commands. And at the end of that, of John 12, we're told what the commandment is. That is, the commandment that the Father has given the Son is, my commandment, Jesus says, is, his commandment is eternal life. That is his commandment. And so if Rabboni means the teacher who commands, then this is what he's commanding. And in calling Mary by name, he is calling her to life. And so I think in the Easter narrative, it has that particular connotation, the teacher whose commandment is life. And that commandment is conveyed to Mary as he calls her by name. So it picks up a number of the very important and rich themes that kind of course through the gospel, and all come to a very poignant climax in that very meaningful exchange between Jesus and Mary. Mary, and she recognizes him and says, Rabboni. And it's at that point where she worships. She recognizes him as the source of life, the one who has life in himself. And she has heard his commandment, live, and she lives. So I think so some very rich motifs kind of all come together, kind of flow together in that one climactic moment. Very dense, very concentrated, but nevertheless very important for us to understand what it means for Jesus to have life in himself, and for that to be revealed specifically in the resurrection.
Oh, that's helpful. Well, I know you're currently working on a commentary on John's Gospel for Baker, so I look forward to that. Let me ask you just one other question related to the resurrection. Now, you've been teaching the New Testament for multiple decades now. Previously, you taught in Ethiopia. Now you teach at Trinity in suburban Chicago. And over those years of teaching and study, are there any ways in which your understanding of the resurrection has changed? And if so, how?
I think I grew up in churches where the resurrection was important primarily for apologetic reasons. That is, if you could prove that Jesus rose from the dead, then it served as a kind of verification or validation that everything that we claim about the crucifixion is true.
Right.
So it mattered not as a kind of end in itself or as something that had kind of theological importance in and of itself, but it mattered apologetically to demonstrate that justification by faith really did happen in the crucifixion. But I don't think I understood that the resurrection itself was inherent to the gospel. That is, it's important to the gospel message itself, that through Jesus' death and resurrection, we receive forgiveness of sin. And as Peter says, through the resurrection, we are born again into new life. And so this idea of the resurrection being for us, the resurrection of Jesus being for us, a way into new creation, a way into this transformed way of life. If there's anything that marks a secular age, anything that is, kind of evacuated, if you live in a particularly, a peculiarly imminent frame, a material only world, there's no possibility of restoration because there's nothing outside of the material world that would possibly come in and change you. But the resurrection is God's declaration that life comes from outside of ourselves and that he is the source of life. And through the resurrection, that life is made available to us as his people.
Well, that's great. And I think that really does help set the tone for us as we prepare to celebrate Easter. Now, you've shared with us kind of some of your academic work in the Gospels, but let's just talk for a moment about your academic background. In terms of your education, you completed a PhD at Cambridge, and while you were at Cambridge, Tyndale House. The library at Tyndale House was, I think, an important part of your experience. So how has Tyndale House really affected and influenced your life and academic work?
Well, it made an extraordinary difference. We arrived at Tyndale House knowing we had just a very short amount of time. We had been serving in Ethiopia as missionaries, and there was some urgency about our need to get back to Ethiopia. And because everything was just right there, and because it was such a rich community, we were able to live right there with the resources. We lived at Tyndale House for 2 years, just across the street for our first year. But it meant I didn't have to, I wasn't chasing up resources all over the country. I was, everything I needed was right there at Tyndale House. And then those regular breaks where, just had people who working in similar areas, able to bounce ideas off of, you kind of maintain that kind of, rich kind of evangelical theological context for the study of the scriptures. It just, it made all the difference. And so we're able to finish the project, the PhD in 3 years, get back to Ethiopia and serve there, working with a new graduate school that was established there just before I got back. Was the dean there, first dean of the school, and just kind of served as a platform for the next 15, 16 years of ministry in Ethiopia, and now coming to Trinity, where students are coming from all over the world. At least for me, Trinity, that time at Tyndale House just served as a platform for engaging the global global evangelical movement, and doing our small piece to strengthen that movement for the Lord's glory.
Well, Steve, I want to thank you for sharing some of your work with us, and I do look forward to reading in the future some of the stuff you're working on now. And for those of you watching, if you'd like to know more about the ministry and the work of Tyndale House, you can check out our website, friendsoftyndalehouse.com. And finally, let me just say thanks to those of you who were supporting Tyndale House, because your partnership financially really does help foster the kind of scholarship that Steve has shared with us over the last few moments. So Steve, as always, it's a pleasure to talk with you, and thank you for your work and really for your ongoing contribution to biblical scholarship.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode on the Tyndale House Scholars in America series, brought to you by the American Friends of Tyndale House. I'm Dr. Peter Williams, the principal of Tyndale House in Cambridge. I want personally to thank you for joining us for this video. We exist to spread and support good Bible scholarship, so please subscribe to our YouTube channel, add notifications, like the videos, share them, and visit our website, friendsoftyndalehouse.com, where you can see past episodes and other material. Also, please consider making a donation and even becoming a monthly supporter, where you can get behind our work of spreading Bible scholarship in service of the church. Thank you.